The first property that I would like to talk about is temperature. There are two different temperatures that can affect the quality of our prints. The first one is the temperature of the nozzle, and the second one is the temperature of the bed. Let's start with the temperature of the nozzle. Temperature of the nozzle is the temperature that determines how well will be the filament pushed through the nozzle. Usually the vendors specify to us the range of the temperature that we should be working with. If the temperature is lower than the temperature we have been suggested by the vendor, then we can have troubles pushing the filament out of the nozzle. The filament can be clogged inside of the extruder, and then we will need to deassemble the extruder and remove the filament. It's quite of a process and lengthy process, so you don't want to do that. So always make sure that your temperature is above the minimum temperature that's been suggested by the vendors. On the other side, if the temperature is too high, if we exceed the range, what can happen is that the filament will start burning. And by burning, I don't mean that it will catch fire. It will start losing its properties in the best case. In the worst case, it will start sublimating into different particles that can be harmful for our health. So make sure to never exceed the given maximum number of the temperature that has been suggested by the vendor. How do we know what is the best temperature of the nozzle specifically for our printer? We have to learn to interpret the feedback that the 3D printer is giving us during printing. So the first thing that we can check for is the stream and the thickness of the loaded filament. When we are loading filament, what we want to see is to have a very nice stream, a very nice consistent line, a consistent stream of filament. It shouldn't be too thin. If it's too thin, then it probably means that the extruder is having troubles pushing out the filament. And then if during printing we observe that the 3D printer is leaving a lot of dots on the bed, and it's leaving a lot of marks on the bed. The prints are not being clean, they're very hairy and very oozy. Then what it means is that the temperature is too high. And that's why it's leaving these little strings of hairs and dots everywhere. In that case, if we see that this is happening, then we need to lower the temperature. If during printing you can hear your filament popping, so it's making this popping sound when it's coming out of the nozzle, then it can mean two things. The first thing can be that your filament absorbed too much humidity, which all of the filaments have tendency to do, but the TPUs and the flexible filaments specifically absorb a lot of water out of our environment. And then what happens is that when we are printing and pushing out the filament through the hot nozzle, the water inside of filament starts boiling and evaporates. And as it evaporates, what it creates is these little bubbles that pop during printing. That's why we hear the popping sound, which sounds like it's not a trouble, but it affects the quality of our prints, because instead of having a nice stream of a filament, we have this crooked filament that can break whenever we are trying to stretch our fabrics. So it's very important to check for the popping sound. It might be that your filament is too humid, and if your filament is too humid, what you can do is to dry the filament, or make sure always when you stop printing with your filament to seal your filaments in a bag. If you're sure that your filament is dry or hasn't been opened yet and still you can hear the popping sound, then what can be the cause is that the temperature is too high. And if the temperature is too high, then what it means is that the filament is boiling. And since it's boiling, then you can hear the popping sound again. So what can help is that you lower the temperature. It can be also a test if your filament is actually boiling or if it's just too humid. If you lower the temperature by 5 or 10, 7 degrees and you still hear the popping sound, then it definitely is that there is too much humidity in your filament and you need to try it out. If you don't, if it helps, then it just meant that your temperature was too high. Let's have a look at the temperature of the bed. The temperature of the bed determines how soft will be our 3D printed textile. You will hear from a lot of people that there is no need to print on heated beds. And yes, it does save the environment, so we don't need to use the exceeded amount of energy to heat our 3D printers. But from my experience, when you do heat the bed, then the result of the textile is usually much softer, first of all. And then the second added benefit of having a heated bed is that you make sure that your filament is definitely going to stick, and specifically when you want it to stick nicely to your bed. So it's important that we actually heat our bed and make sure that we get the best result of our 3D printed textiles. Perfect. What I want you to do is to make a research of what are the best settings for your 3D printer. You can print 3 to 5 swatches with different temperatures and see how the temperature affects the quality of your print. Make sure that when you are changing the temperature, make it incremental by small steps. So instead of jumping from 230 to 350, just change the temperature by 2 to 5 degrees, and you should see a big change immediately. Go ahead and do your research.